Improvisations to Go is about to commence. It can only commence at all thanks to the generosity of Aubrey's and their to-go service and the wonderful help from Dr. Craig and Debbie Jarvis. Thanks to them, now we shall commence. So, here's the challenge. Go to any city in the world on a Sunday and locate one great live jazz concert to attend. Before the concert, have a meal that you will later describe as superb, and it's not just some boiled variation on French fries and chicken. Extra points for a mind-blowing museum that's open on Sundays. If the city you chose checks all three of those boxes, you are in a world-class city. If it does not check those three boxes, you are not in a world-class city. I'm sorry, Toledo, Ohio. It's the way it is. I have to draw the line somewhere. That's where I draw it. I chose Memphis, Tennessee, and I arrived on a Sunday. I got on my computer and I Googled live jazz music tonight, Memphis. Only one thing popped up, and it was a direct hit. When you leave a lot of space in your travel plans to improvise, sometimes the travel gods will smite thee. Other times they'll shine the light on you. In this case, the light was shining. The Bad Plus were in town. Though not from Memphis, the Bad Plus is one of the great American jazz groups. They have that punk ethos of sticking to their guns, touring constantly, breaking any rules that get in their way, and basically trying anything they want to try. I mean, they cover Rush, the Bee Gees, and Black Sabbath just as easily as they cover Ornette Coleman, and their stellar originals only sound like the Bad Plus. No small feat. Add in that they've only had one personnel change in 20 years, and that, my friends, is a jazz record that will never be broken, I predict. So yeah, I was pumped to see them with their new piano player, Orrin Evans, another hero of mine. We sat down as he munched on some delicious-looking soup. I asked him how many times had he played in Memphis, Tennessee.
Maybe 4 times. Maybe it's the 4th time now that I think about it. The funny thing is, I'm only remembering it because I'm basing it on barbecue places that I've been to. And I remember, oh, this is the 4th time. So, but I don't get a chance to come here that often. And it's a great, energy and the history, good and bad, that exists here. And I mean, there's good and bad history in Philadelphia. There's good and bad history everywhere. It's America. So, but it's important. And I really love the spirit when I get here, and especially this venue. I really like what it's about and the convenience and everything.
The venue in question, Crosstown Theater, a gorgeous, acoustically perfect 400-seat venue that was made for live music. It's part of the Crosstown Arts Complex. What is this place? What's the mission? I asked the theater director, who has the best name possible for someone in her job, Jazzy Miller.
So the space, it's a multi-purpose space. So if we're not doing private events or if we're not doing, collaborations with tenants in the community and renting the space out to tenants in the Crosstown community, we're doing music shows, live music shows, film. We have a film night every Thursday, which is geared towards an underground cult vibe. We've got a theater program, an after-school youth theater program on Wednesdays, where we send the bus around the community, bring kids in, and they write, perform, and produce their own plays, and they perform them here and all over the community.
It had been quite a few years since I had visited Memphis, and it seems to really have changed. I asked music director Jenny Davis about that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's kind of hard to put your finger on it exactly what's happening, but it does, it does seem like something's happening. People are staying in Memphis and moving to Memphis, which is great. I think in the past, a lot of people grow up here and then they end up leaving. But now I think there are more things, people are wanting to stick around for. There's, lots of cool things like crosstown. And yeah, I think it's a great time to be in Memphis, and I'm really curious to see, what it's going to be like in 5 years from now. And I think one really cool thing about Memphis is, when cities grow, sometimes they grow in great ways, and then there are other things that come along with growth that aren't always the best. But I think Memphis, I don't know, there's something that I think just won't change about Memphis, like that grittiness in a good way. So I love Memphis for that reason.
I talked to Jenny for a while, and we caught up on how they were helping musicians during the pandemic. Of course, we got into barbecue, but on the particular evening I was there, I didn't have barbecue at all. I did have, however, the best meal I had in Memphis. It was right across the hall, basically, from Crosstown Theater. It's a place called the Global Cafe. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it. It's kind of an international food hall. The cooks are refugees and immigrants from around the world, and you can get Syrian food, food from Sudan, Venezuelan food, all under one roof. And I have to admit, yes, I basically had 3 dinners because I couldn't make up my mind. The vibe of the place is great too. There are lots of beautiful photographs on the wall featuring refugees that have settled in Memphis. If you go to Memphis and you want great international food, there's my recommendation, Global Cafe. Sunday night in Memphis was a smash hit for me. So what do you do for an encore on Monday? I didn't even bother to do an internet search. I just walked down to Beale Street. It's famous. I mean, there's got to be something going on. And yeah, there was. There was a lot going on. Not as many people as a weekend, which was nice, but the bands were all just cooking. There are a lot of rock bands, blues bands, R&B reviews, top-notch players in every band. I tried to find some jazz, ask around for that. Good, how you doing? I'm looking for jazz music, but I think it's mostly blues down here.
Well, we had jazz last night. The orchestra comes every Sunday at 6 to 9 on Sunday night.
So next Sunday I'll have back here again? What kind of music you got?
This is what you hear. They play everything.
Okay. Is there any jazz clubs?
I don't know. Most of the bands just rotate. That's word out here.
Not much luck in that search. So I enjoyed a couple of groups, got a snack or two, and I wasn't quite ready to go back to the Airbnb and stare at architecture photos, so I sent a message to John Paul Keith. Now, he's a musician whose work I've loved since he was a member of the legendary Knoxville band, the V-Roys. He had been in Memphis, I think, like 10 or 15 years, and he really knew the music scene. So I called him up and said, "What's going on a Monday?" Well, the travel gods were smiling yet again. He told me he was playing in an Elvis-themed hotel across from Graceland. I should stop by because he had Joe Restivo with him, a local jazz guitar ace. I mean, he had me at Elvis-themed hotel, but I was all in for it. Let me tell you, John Paul Keith sounded fantastic. His singing has gotten incredibly great, and I love the addition with Joe Restivo on guitar. The songs were really, really wonderful, and they were just playing this great music in this weird hotel. And of course, who walks up uninvited in the middle of their set but an Elvis impersonator? He sang a little bit of Blue Christmas, and John Paul Keith was pretty good-spirited about it, but eventually they had to kind of pull him over to the side and say, "Hey, look, Elvis, we're working here, okay?" So I had a great time, and after their set, we hung out at the bar, and I did what any old friend would do when reconnecting after 15 years. I asked for an interview. Hey, you guys got like 5 minutes where I can just talk to you about Memphis?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just waiting on my food.
All right.
Hanging out.
I'm just going to put that there.
Yeah, sure.
Does that thing work? So,
Is this thing on?
yeah.
Am I on?
This is kind of one of the things I'm trying to get at is, what is it about Memphis in terms of the feel of it? Because I swear everything that it comes out of here just has this great feel.
I don't know, Joe, you good?
That's a tough question. The food? Is it the food? Is it the river? Is it the
Humidity?
The humidity? Is it the? I mean, frankly, there's been the pain of some things that have happened. Whether it be racial strife, racial oppression, the King shooting. Before that, there was always like amazing music and also amazing some issues. I mean, if you read about Beale Street in the turn of the century, it was an amazing place, but it was also a place that if you weren't looking out, you might not walk out of that place.
Very genres have never really meant anything here or much of anything here,
Right.
and that's really where you get this. And I don't know why that is, but you get a real mixture of styles, and that's what Memphis always does. Is it just brings different things together in this
It's a
unique
hub
way.
city. It's a hub city.
Yeah.
And it's on the river. There's rail lines coming through here, so people are moving through the city. I mean, you had a massive migration of African Americans coming out of Mississippi,
Right.
going through here, some staying.
WC
a lot going to Chicago.
W.C. Handy was from
He was from Muscle
Florence,
Shoals,
Alabama,
yeah.
or Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Sam Phillips was from there also, from Florence, Alabama, and they were drawn here for the same reason.
If you ever end up in an Elvis-themed hotel and John Paul Keith and Joe Restivo were there, make sure you talk to them about Memphis music. They really have studied it, they love it, they appreciate it. And one of the things we talked about was not just a mixture of styles, but just how many great musicians have come out of Memphis and how many great ones are still there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, there's no bottom to it. You never reach the end of it as far as the musical stuff. After 15 years here, I still learn something every day there where I'm like, oh, he played on that, or who so-and-so did that, or what, or what chord was that? It's just it's a total immersion. I've had the privilege of having total immersion in this music for 15 years and living around here and meeting some people that played on that stuff. I've gotten to know Howard Grimes, drums on all, my favorite records, some of your favorite records,
As you can imagine, that conversation went on for a while. We ended up talking about session musicians on Al Green records and how many of them were still there. They played on the Don Bryant record we listened to in episode 5, and John Paul Keith was trying to get some musicians to play like Hubby or play like Howard, and he realized, hey, I can just call these guys, they'll come play on my record. And that's how the Memphis scene is. That living history is still there. It's a rich, rich scene. And Memphis is a rich, rich scene for museums. One I found just by walking by it was the Cotton Museum. I didn't know such a thing existed. And I had 20 minutes and I figured, I've handed over my money to the Pinball Museum in another city and a Spoon Museum in another city, so a Cotton Museum, that's a no-brainer. I had no idea how much I would get out of it. It's small, but the story of cotton is huge, and the story of cotton is really important to understanding the history of Memphis and realizing the absolutely raw deal the black folks were dealt in the midst of this incredibly profitable cotton business boom. In just about every conversation I had in Memphis, the subject of race relations came up, and it should when you're trying to understand the history of Memphis. Race relations play a big part and a very painful part in its history. Malvin Massey told me about his experience when I talked with him at WUMR.
I mean, I'm from a time, my dad used to have to step off the sidewalk to let white people walk by. And I got my mother and me kicked out of J.C. Penney in Southgate Shopping Center because I drank out of the white water fountain when I was about 8 years old. Those kind of experiences have totally changed now. And the city has gotten a lot more cosmopolitan over the years.
Malvin and I talked about my experiences at the Cotton Museum, where I learned about the Cotton Carnival, this big Memphis social event that basically excluded almost all black people.
Speaking of cotton, so Memphis always had the Cotton Carnival. From the outset of the Cotton Carnival, it was all about white. And the only black people that were involved in that were the guys that they used for pulling the floats. So some of the ladies in town. Miss Vincent and I think Maxine Smith and some others got together. And since we couldn't be part of the Cotton Carnival, they created a Cotton Makers Jubilee. And so we had our parade on Beale Street. And I was a Duke one time. But it was like that in this town. If we couldn't have access to what was going on in the major population, well, we created our own access. We couldn't go to the zoo except on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the zoo and the fairgrounds. And we accepted that. Tuesdays and Thursdays, we were there. You know, it was like that. You know, we just accepted that as the way it was. And then later years on, now you think about it, like, man, that was pretty low down. You know?
But really, the worst was yet to come. I asked Malvin about where he was and what he was doing on the day that Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated.
When I got up in the studio and turned the radio on, that's when I found out he had been killed. And it just, you're kidding. Totally freaked me out. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I called my mom, told her to come get me. And she was crying, and it was really a devastating thing. And I just, like I said, all of a sudden, I just hated white people because that, you know. Along with Kennedy, when Kennedy was killed when I was in junior high school. That really upset me too. It upset everybody. But yeah, it was a devastating thing.
Malvin mentioned, though there are racial problems in other American cities, in Memphis, for him, it's always felt more personal and a little more deeply rooted in that regard. And the assassination of Dr. King certainly plays a part in that. I talked to Garrett McQueen about this. He's a former WUOT music announcer and is now overnight announcing on Music Through the Night, a national syndicated music program. He's a Memphis native.
I'll make a sort of comparison between that and 9/11. So, you know, folks who are in New York City are just going to have a different perspective on that tragedy as opposed to, those of us who were just watching things on the news. It's the same thing with the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Listening to my grandmother and my mom, who was a little girl during the time, talk about what the local news looked like and local actions that were taken, all the way down to the fact that if you go to the National Civil Rights Museum, which is, placed at the Lorraine Motel where he was assassinated, you see that the museum really affirms the fact that this was a co-opted effort between several different powers, whether you want to say it was the FBI, the local police, but that's a sort of truth that doesn't really make it through the history books, in my opinion, and that folks who really aren't from Memphis don't quite understand. If you go to the National Civil Rights Museum, on one of the plaques, you'll see that on the local television news, not only did they publish the fact that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was staying at that motel, his room number was on the news. So it's just little things that that really make you scratch your head, and little things that you never really get to learn about unless you're really on the ground at ground zero, so to speak.
Always enjoy talking with Garrett McQueen. He gets me to see things from a different perspective, or in a new light, or with different context than maybe I'm seeing things, which gives me a broader understanding of what it is I'm seeing. Even the term classical music, which is something that he's very familiar with, has a different context for him, especially in the light of his Memphis roots.
The further along in my career that I get, the more I really start to hate that phrase, classical music, because, for us, the classic styles of music that were just in the car or in the house, it was jazz, and the same way in which one family might turn on their classical station for dinner, or on your way to church, so you don't feel like you're being too much of a heathen on your way to the church house. The same way they would play so-called classical music. In my household, it was very much jazz, and that was the most classic style of music that I was exposed to as a youngster.
Garrett McQueen's first visit to the National Civil Rights Museum was as a performer with his classmates from Keystone Elementary. They sang a song there. My first visit there was on this very trip to Memphis. I'd always avoided it because I felt like I didn't have enough time to process what was in there, and that's probably true even with a 3-hour visit. But one of the main things I learned there that I'd never heard before was that Dr. Martin Luther King was talking to a jazz musician in the parking lot right before he was assassinated, a guy named Ben Branch, who was the musical director for Operation Breadbasket, an organization that was going to perform a benefit for Dr. King. Dr. King had just asked Branch to play a spiritual called Precious Lord, Take My Hand at a rally that was to have been held about 2 hours later. Ben Branch said sure, he would be happy to play it. And then a shot rang out. When I got back to my room that evening, my heart was pretty heavy from the visit to the museum and still processing everything that I had seen and heard there. So I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I put on jazz music. In this case, Harold Mayburn's recording A Few Miles from Memphis with George Coleman and Blue Mitchell. And it wasn't lost on me, the very folks who had suffered untold decades of abuse are the primary source for this deep, soulful, medicinal, healing, inspirational music. And thinking about that now, I remember my conversation with Delphio Marcellus about the gift of jazz music. That conversation came about when I was explaining to him my experience on the train when the internet went out and the cell service was not available, how everyone on the train started talking to each other, and how I sensed deep down so many of us want to get along with each other.
Black folk don't have any problem getting along with people. That's just not what it ever has been. You know what I mean? It's just, it's never been that. You know, and I was saying this in, while I don't want to give him credit, I will just say that the major shooting that happened, I guess it was in South Carolina, there's several tragedies. The two tragedies are the individuals that were shot were not only upstanding citizens, but they had political ties and they were really doing positive things in the community. And this gentleman walks in and they embrace him. Now, here's the real sad part of it. They embrace him. They, man, come on in. You know, this is for everybody. And his reaction was, man, I have so much hatred in me that I have to kill these people. And this is just an issue that, as a generality, that in the black community, it's always about forgiveness and healing. You know, no one has forgiven more than the African American. But we have to constantly work. The African American has always had to work to try to help this country deal with democracy. The enslaved people, like you take jazz, so you talked about jazz, right? One of the great ironies of jazz is that it's a music that was primarily created by African Americans, and they were the ones who were denied the liberties, the right to, the great words that are in our Declaration of Independence and Constitution. They were denied those rights and privileges, and they came up with the music that best embodies what democracy is, right? The simple definition of democracy is everyone has a voice and you work together for the overall. An oversimplification of what it is, but that's how jazz is. Everyone gets an opportunity to solo if they would like, but it's all about what is the group accomplishing.
What is the group accomplishing? What are we accomplishing? In these trips, I love exploring jazz music, but when you go to somewhere like Memphis or New Orleans or Washington, D.C., you can't separate the history from the music. It's all intertwined. And even some of the most painful parts really inform some of the most beautiful parts. Every ingredient makes the stew, and this stew has no bottom. Looking back on this trip to New Orleans and Memphis and on the train, I'm almost overwhelmed by the gratitude I have for all the folks I talked to, who openly and freely shared their stories, their time, and their wisdom. I hope I absorbed at least some of that wisdom along the way, and here in 2020, when a trip like this seems like almost a fantasy that could never happen again, I hope that you've enjoyed virtually taking the trip with me. One of the things I noticed on this trip was that travel, in its own magical, indefinable way, forces me to be just a little more alive. And it helps me to connect to people when I otherwise might not, especially when you're, say, quarantined, either by choice or by necessity. So, when we get back out there, and we will get back out there, maybe this experience of being cut off from each other and being separated from live music and trains and busy coffee shops, maybe all of that will help us even more deeply appreciate the opportunities to do simple things with each other once again. What could be more magnificent?
Improvisations to Go is a production of WUOT. This podcast was made possible by the generosity of Dr. Craig and Debbie Jarvis and their verified hunting poodle, Curly Sue. Also, thanks for the wonderful support of Aubrey's Restaurant. Like this podcast, you can get it to go.
This podcast would be meaningless, if not just simply boring, without the gift of music. In this episode, we had music by Harold Mayburn, The Bad Plus, Joe Restivo, Ben Branch, the Delvin Lamar Organ Trio, and original music featuring on the drums, bleedin' Matt Richardson. I'm Todd Steed. Take care of yourself. We got a lot of traveling left to do, and we'll do it.